Mr. Shavinko was the toughest teacher in our high school. He was 6 foot something, a bear of a man, who marched around campus with a look on his face that even the most unruly of students found daunting. Having immigrated from Eastern Europe after the collapse of the old Soviet Union, he spoke with a heavy accent, but his English was perfect. He taught physics in an emotionless, sterile manner on his bad days. His tone of voice could be described as a bark. One day, during an unusually interesting class, Mr. Shavinko was going over the different types of radiation that exist. A studious pupil in the front row raised a hand to ask him how he knew so much about the subject. "I did some work for the power plant in my home country," he replied dryly, turning to the chalkboard and beginning a crudely drawn diagram. One of the jock douchebags, who was known for being somewhat of a bully, made a comment about how it was probably him the one that blew it up. Mr. Shavinko's chalk snapped. The hand that gripped the broken piece trembled as he lowered it to his side. With an audible sigh, the teacher turned back around, his eyes fixed on the disrespectful jock. "Have you ever seen your friends die?" It was the first time any of us had ever heard him talk in a way that didn't make us flinch, but somehow his tone was even more frightening than before. The jock didn't respond. "I asked you a question, boy." The jock remained silent, his cheeks turning a shade of crimson as Mr. Shavinko's beady brown eyes bore into him. With the same flat facial expression, the furious teacher walked towards the classroom's door. The room shifted as he locked it. "New lesson today. Close your books."
Mr. Shavinko, sir?
A nervous-looking girl in glasses raised her hand. She was unable to hide the raw fear in her voice.
I don't feel comfortable.
"Shut up, girl. You thank the boy with a big mouth later. This is a collective punishment," Mr. Shavinko hissed, taking a seat at his desk. We waited, the tension thick in the air as we dreaded to think what Mr. Shavinko had in store for us. We'd never seen him as angry as he was now. Some people said they smelled alcohol on his breath some days. I felt a knot of fear in my guts as I pictured the morbid newspaper headlines that might follow the next day. "The most important time of my life happened before any of you were ever born," Mr. Shavinko began it. "It was the 25th of April, 1986, the day the entire world ended for my town. I had recently returned from Moscow after studying nuclear physics in the university there. I was glad to be home. It was the start of a new life for me. I had a girlfriend I hoped to marry once I found work. Pripyat, it was a beautiful place, forest nearby, streams for fishing. That evening was warm with a clear, cloudless sky. Above Pripyat was a ceiling of stars, a blanket of celestial bodies that you could lose yourself into for hours. But that same night, an accident near our town changed my life forever." I knew what he was going to say before he even said it. The words were on my lips before he even uttered them. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant. There was a saying in my homeland: "We pretend to work, and the government pretends to pay us." The class could see the sadness in our teacher's eyes as he spoke. It was like that back then. Communism had destroyed people's desires to better themselves. Years of incompetence and corruption meant that there was a design flaw in one of the new reactors. When the safety test began, the reactor was like a loaded gun, just waiting to go off. So when the control rods were removed to raise the power again, he calmly looked over the disrespectful jock, narrowing his eyes as he leaned into his desk. Mr. Shavinko's roar sent the jock reeling in his seat. The rest of the class didn't fare too well either. We were gripped, hanging on to our teacher's every word. But what no one knew, thanks to years of error and cover-up, was that there was a fatal flaw in the reactor design that made it unstable at low power levels. As power levels were lowered in preparation for the test, they dropped too low and the reactor ground to a halt. Meanwhile, unseen and dangerous hotspots were forming, building deep within the reactor. 2 huge explosions that shook the earth beneath our feet. Every man, woman, and child in Pripyat heard the bangs, but we had no idea what it was. Some of the off-duty workers feared the worst, but none of us could have fathomed that what was about to unfold was the worst nuclear disaster in our history. I felt the shock wave as I looked towards the power station. A pillar of smoke rose up into the clear night sky, and though the inky blackness of night, I made out twinkles of flames in the distance. Some of the people in my apartment block thought war had broken out. Then myself and the people of Pripyat watched in awe and terror as a huge stream of ionizing radiation shot into the heavens, lighting up the night with a hideous blue glow. We thought the world was ending. For us, it certainly was. People were terrified beyond belief, but I must admit, I found myself smiling as I looked out into the night. It was titanic, like looking at the face of God, a gargantuan mass of pure energy. It was beautiful. The melancholic look never left Mr. Shavinko's eyes, even if a small, nostalgic grin did curl his lips. But that was only the start of it. What came after, both as a result of the accident and the government's mishandling of it, was much more horrific. The teacher never took his eyes off the jock, as if every single word was directed at him. It must have been torturous. It certainly was for the rest of us. We were forced to listen. We had no escape. Did you know that they bust in troops of entertainers to keep some of the nearer villagers calm as they died of radiation poisoning? Let me describe to you one such performance, Mr. Shavinko began. A beautiful ballerina dancing her final dance. Strands of her blonde hair floated to the floor as she twirled. I saw blood leaking from her nostrils, down her cheeks as it seeped from her ears. The children ran to her with flowers, their hair and teeth already starting to fall out. The generator stalled, and for several moments we were plunged into darkness. Into my complete and utter horror, I saw the flowers and the children glowing in the dark. There were a few gasps in the room. One of the girls in the back row was sobbing quietly into the sleeve of her sweater. The cleanup involved the work of 30,000 people, continued the teacher. There are less people in this town. Think of that. 30,000 people. They call them the liquidators, a disgusting euphemism coined by a man too cowardly to call them what they were. The condemned. Do you know what it's like, boy, to have to look your friend in the eye and tell him to walk towards his own painful death? Do you? Shavinko growled towards the jock. You look to me like you would have no problem, as long as it would save your own skin. 4 million people suffer today from something that happened 30 years ago. 4 million. He stood up and walking slowly towards the desk that now sat the terrified jock. And you think this is funny? Yes. The jock shook his head violently, still too terrified to speak. His eyes begged for mercy. Yes, you laughed. You think that seeing children being burned from the inside out, dying the most painful death imaginable, never knowing why or how they were being murdered by something they couldn't even see. You think this is a joke, don't you? Mr. Shevchenko towered over the boy's desk, eyes wide and full of fury. We waited for him to snap, for him to beat the living hell out of the kid. But he just turned, walked towards the door, and unlocked it. "Class dismissed," he murmured. I've never seen a classroom of kids move so quickly in my life. Not even on the last day of school did we tear out of a building like that. But on the way out, I slowed, stopping near Mr. Shevchenko's desk and feeling the anxiety build. He looked up at me, the same sadness filling his eyes as I spoke.
I'm sorry.
He just nodded, and without another word, I departed.
When a similar accident happened in Great Britain, and you'll be hearing more about that in a few minutes, British authorities suppressed the details for more than 25 years. It is hardly surprising, then, that the Soviet Union, which has an infinitely more secretive tradition, is revealing only the sparsest information about its own nuclear disaster. But disaster is how even the Soviets are describing it. But where they concede 2 dead, diplomatic and other sources claim that more than 2,000 may already have died.